Clara May Thompson held $5 million of a dead man's genius in her shaking hands, a billionaire's one-of-a-kind watch that had just died, and she had nothing but a bobby pin from her own hair to resurrect it. One wrong move, one microscopic slip, and she would not only shatter the timepiece, but also sever Julian Vance's last tangible link to the father he'd buried a decade ago. The future of a multi-billion-dollar energy deal and her own desperate, threadbare existence hung on the steadiness of a hand that had spent the last 8 hours carrying plates of seared foie gras and pouring $100 glasses of wine. The hush that descended upon the Apex, a restaurant that felt less like a dining room and more like a cathedral to wealth suspended 80 floors above Central Park, was so absolute you could hear the faint hum of the city far below. Prisms of light from a constellation of Swarovski crystal chandeliers danced across tables set with fret linens and Christofle silverware. Here, the titans of industry, the inheritors of dynastic fortunes, and the architects of global policy gathered to murmur about mergers and acquisitions over plates of food that cost more than Clara May's monthly rent. But tonight, in this rarefied air, an event was unfolding that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of a young woman from the coal-dusted hollows of West Virginia. A woman armed with nothing more than hope, grit, and a forgotten legacy of her own. Clara May had never pictured a life like this, not even in her wildest dreams. At 22, she was a ghost in the machine of New York City, one of millions who had come to the metropolis chasing a promise. For her, that promise was solvency. She was here to pay off the crushing medical debt left behind after her father, Earl Thompson, had finally succumbed to the black lung that had shadowed his life for years. Earl had been a different kind of genius, a man whose university was a cluttered garage behind their clapboard house in Boone County. He was a master tinkerer, a self-taught mechanic and horologist who could coax life back into anything with a gear or a piston. He fixed rusted-out Ford pickups, ancient John Deere tractors, and, his greatest passion, timepieces. From grandfather clocks that had ticked through the Civil War to the simple Timex watches of his neighbors, Earl treated each with a surgeon's reverence. Clara May's childhood was spent not with dolls, but with loops and tweezers. The scent of machine oil and metal polish was the perfume of her youth. While other girls learned to braid hair, she learned to disassemble and reassemble a Swiss lever escapement. Her father taught her the language of mechanics, the silent conversation between a balance wheel and a hairspring. "Everything is a system, Clara girl," he'd say, his voice raspy from the coal dust and cheap cigarettes. "Understand the system, and you can fix anything. A watch, an engine, a person's broken spirit. It's all about finding the one little piece that's out of place." When Earl died, he left behind a mountain of bills and a legacy of knowledge. But knowledge couldn't keep the bank from foreclosing or put food on her grandmother's table. So Clara May did what generations of Appalachians had done before her. She left the mountains. New York was a brutal, glittering dream. Her first year was a blur of exhausting, low-wage jobs, stocking shelves at a 24-hour bodega, cleaning hotel rooms, anything to make ends meet. She lived in a cramped fifth-floor walk-up in Queens with 3 other roommates, sleeping on a couch that smelled of stale pizza and shattered dreams. But Clara May possessed an inheritance far more valuable than money, her father's relentless work ethic and his eye for detail. She observed, she learned, she adapted. She practiced enunciating her words to soften her mountain drawl, studied the names on wine bottles she couldn't afford to drink, and memorized the complex dietary restrictions of the city's elite. When a position opened at the Apex, she applied on a whim, never believing she'd get it. But the general manager, a severe man named Marcus Thorne, had been short-staffed. He'd hired her with a dismissive sneer, making it clear he thought her background was a liability. "We serve the most powerful people in the world here, Miss Thompson," he'd said during her interview, his eyes flicking over her simple, second-hand dress. "They expect perfection, not rustic charm." The apex was another world. The kitchen was a gleaming stainless steel marvel, run by a celebrity chef with a fiery temper. The wine cellar contained bottles that could finance a college education. The clientele arrived in chauffeured Bentleys and Maybachs, their conversations shaping the very fabric of the global economy. Clara May, in her starched black uniform, learned to be a phantom, moving with silent efficiency. She arrived an hour early for every shift, polishing her own section's silverware until it gleamed, ensuring every salt shaker was perfectly aligned. She developed a preternatural ability to anticipate a guest's needs. A refilled water glass, a fresh napkin, the check presented at the precise moment a conversation lulled. She also couldn't help but notice the small mechanical failings of the grand establishment. A hinge on a service door that squeaked almost imperceptibly, which she silenced with a tiny drop of olive oil from the kitchen. A loose screw on a brass railing that she tightened with the edge of a butter knife when no one was looking. A faulty latch on a colleague's locker that she fixed with a bent paperclip. They were tiny acts of order, echoes of her father's garage in a place that would have appalled him with its excess. On this crisp October evening, as the city lights began to sparkle like a carpet of fallen stars below, Clara May had no inkling that her father's lessons were about to collide with the rarefied world of the apex. The night that would redefine her life was just unfolding. And at table 7, the best table in the house, with an uninterrupted view of the park, a man whose meticulously constructed world was about to fracture, was losing his composure. Julian Vance was a man unaccustomed to helplessness. At 45, he was a titan of the new economy, a self-made billionaire who had built a renewable energy empire from a single, revolutionary patent for battery storage. Forbes pegged his net worth at a conservative $12 billion. He owned a penthouse just a few blocks from the restaurant, a sprawling estate in Napa, and a private jet that could circle the globe. He sat at table 7 in a bespoke Brioni suit, the fabric so fine it seemed to flow rather than hang. His hair, just beginning to show distinguished threads of silver at the temples, was impeccably styled. To the world, he was the epitome of power and control. But tonight, a cold knot of anxiety was tightening in his gut. This wasn't a dinner for pleasure. Across the table sat Kenji Tanaka, the formidable chairman of a Japanese tech conglomerate, and his team of lawyers and engineers. They were in the final, delicate stages of negotiating a $4 billion partnership, a deal that would allow Vance's company to scale globally and fundamentally change the world's energy grid. The negotiations had been grueling, stretching over 6 months and 3 continents. Tonight was meant to be the final handshake, the celebratory toast. Yet despite the monumental stakes, Julian's attention kept being drawn to his left wrist. There, nestled against his skin, was the Vacheron Constantin Eterna, a watch that did not officially exist. It was a unique piece, commissioned by his father, a brilliant but uncelebrated mechanical engineer named David Vance. The case was platinum, the face a stunning lapis lazuli dial that charted the celestial movements over New York City. But its true genius lay within. The movement was a custom tourbillon and perpetual calendar, designed and built, in secret, by his father over a period of 7 years. It was a masterpiece of micro-engineering, valued by appraisers at over $5 million. But to Julian, it was priceless. David Vance had given him the watch in the sterile, quiet room of a hospice 3 days before a fast-moving cancer took him. Julian could still feel the surprising strength in his father's frail hand. "I never built a dynasty for you, son," David had whispered, his voice thin as paper. "I only ever knew how to build things that worked. This is the best thing I ever built. It keeps perfect time. Don't waste yours. Build something that matters." Julian had worn the watch every day since. It was his armor, his touchstone. Through hostile takeovers, market crashes, personal betrayals, and lonely triumphs, the steady, rhythmic beat of the Eterna was a constant, a private conversation with his father's memory. He would touch its cool platinum case during a tense negotiation and feel his father's quiet confidence. Tonight, as Mr. Tanaka spoke about supply chain logistics, Julian glanced at his wrist, a subconscious habit to ground himself. The deal was close, the final terms laid out. They were on the precipice of success. But at precisely 9:12 p.m., as he reached for his glass of water, a sensation, or rather, a lack of one, sent a jolt of ice through his veins. The faint, familiar vibration of the tourbillon against his pulse was gone. He froze. He stared at his wrist, his mind refusing to process what his senses were telling him. The sweeping second hand was motionless, pointing accusingly at the 12. The intricate tourbillon cage, which normally performed a mesmerizing 1-minute rotation, was perfectly still. The perpetual calendar, his father's pride, was frozen between days. His heart began to pound against his ribs, a frantic, chaotic rhythm in stark contrast to the silence on his wrist. It was impossible. The Eterna was a marvel of durability, serviced every 2 years by a single, trusted master horologist in Geneva. It had survived helicopter turbulence, transatlantic flights, even an accidental drop onto a marble floor in his office. How could it just stop? Now? On this night? "Mr. Vance, is everything all right?" Kenji Tanaka's voice sliced through his daze. Julian could barely hear him. He brought his wrist up to his face, his vision narrowing until the watch was the only thing in his world. He turned it over, examining the sapphire crystal caseback that offered a window into his father's soul. And then he saw it, a sight that made his stomach drop. One of the palette jewels on the escapement lever, a microscopic synthetic ruby no bigger than a grain of sand, had somehow become dislodged. It was wedged at a sickening angle against the escape wheel, jamming the entire mechanism. A tiny red fleck of disaster. His mouth went dry. This wasn't a mainspring winding down. This was catastrophic failure. The heart of his father's legacy, the intricate, beating mechanism he had poured his life into, was broken. "Julian," his chief counsel, a sharp woman named Evelyn Reed, murmured from his side. "What is it?" He looked up, and in that moment, the billionaire evaporated, leaving only a grieving son. "It stopped," he said, his voice a choked whisper. "My father's watch. It just stopped working." Evelyn's eyes widened with immediate understanding. She was one of the few people who knew the story behind the watch. The Japanese delegation, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere, exchanged polite but confused glances. A broken watch, however expensive, should not be capable of causing such profound, visible distress in a man of Julian Vance's stature. With hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, Julian unfastened the platinum clasp. The watch felt alien in his palm, a dead weight. The silence of it was a scream. He placed it on the white linen tablecloth beside his untouched plate of Wagyu beef. He tried to force his attention back to the meeting, to the billions of dollars hanging in the balance, but it was like trying to ignore a gaping wound in his chest. Every part of him wanted to bolt from the restaurant, to get on his jet and fly to Geneva, to beg the world's greatest watchmaker to save this piece of his father. The irony was crushing. He could buy another Vacheron Constantin. He could commission a dozen of them. He could buy the entire company if he was so inclined. But he could never, ever replace this watch, with its unique movement and the inscription on the caseback. To Julian, my greatest creation. Build something that matters. Dad. Across the vast dining room, Clara May Thompson, carrying a silver tray with a fresh pot of coffee, began to make her way toward table 7. She was completely unaware that she was walking toward the single most important moment of her life. Clara May had been assigned to the VIP corner tonight, a show of reluctant confidence from Marcus Thorne after the regular senior waiter had called in sick. "Don't screw this up, Thompson," he'd hissed at her during the pre-shift briefing. "Table 7 is Julian Vance. He practically owns half the city. Be quick, be quiet, be invisible." She had taken his words to heart, serving the table with a flawless, unobtrusive grace. She'd noted Mr. Vance's preference for still water, Mr. Tanaka's for decaffeinated coffee, and had catered to their needs before they were even articulated. She had felt the tension of the high-stakes negotiation in the air, a familiar feeling from her father's late-night struggles to fix a machine on a tight deadline. Now, as she approached with the coffee service, she sensed the shift. The focused energy of the business discussion had dissipated, replaced by a thick, awkward silence. Mr. Vance, a man she had only seen in magazines, looking powerful and serene, now looked broken. His gaze was fixed on the watch lying on the table, his face a mask of anguish. Clara May's training screamed at her, "Pour the coffee and leave. Do not engage. Be invisible." But as she drew closer, her eyes were drawn to the watch. It was, without question, the most magnificent timepiece she had ever seen. Even from a few feet away, she could recognize the supreme craftsmanship, the perfect finishing on the platinum case. And through the exhibition caseback, she saw the movement. It was a symphony of brass and steel, of rubies and blued screws. It was the kind of mechanism her father would have wept over. "Good evening," she said softly, her voice barely a murmur as she reached the table. "Coffee?" Evelyn Reed gave a distracted nod. The Japanese businessman politely declined. Julian Vance didn't even seem to register her presence. As Clara May deftly poured the coffee for Evelyn, her gaze fell again upon the watch, and in that instant her world tilted on its axis. Years of leaning over her father's workbench, of studying diagrams in old dog-eared books, of training her eyes to see the infinitesimally small, all coalesced. She saw the problem. She saw the tiny crimson palette jewel wedged against the delicate tooth of an escape wheel. It was a freak occurrence, the kind of one-in-a-million shock that could jam a movement. It was a catastrophic failure, yes, but the damage was localized. The rest of the movement, the gear train, the main spring, the tourbillon cage, it all looked pristine, held in a state of suspended animation, waiting. Fixing it properly would be a monumental task. It would require a sterile environment, specialized tools, and a master's touch to disassemble the escapement, reset the jewel, and recalibrate the entire movement. It was a week's work for a genius, but her father had taught her other things too. Desperate things for desperate customers who couldn't afford a full overhaul. He'd called them percussive adjustments, or field improvisations, ways to nudge a displaced component back into place without a full teardown. It was horological heresy, incredibly risky, and something no sane person would ever attempt on a $5 million watch. Yet, as she stood there, the silver coffee pot in her hand, watching this powerful man grieve over a broken machine, she felt a profound, inexplicable connection. She saw not a billionaire, but a son who had lost his father. She saw not a luxury object, but a vessel of memory. And in that moment, Clara May made a decision that violated every rule she had been given. She set the coffee service down on her tray and took a half-step closer. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the heavy silence. "I apologize for the intrusion, but I believe I can fix your watch." The silence that followed Clara May's audacious statement was of a different quality now, not awkward, but sharp, electric with disbelief, 4 sets of eyes, belonging to people who moved the world's markets, swiveled to stare at the waitress. Evelyn Reed's perfectly sculpted eyebrows shot up. Mr. Tanaka leaned forward, his polite mask replaced by one of genuine curiosity. Julian Vance looked up at her, really saw her for the first time, and his eyes were a tempest of confusion, pain, and a flicker of raw offense. "I beg your pardon." His voice was dangerously soft, the sound of a predator being disturbed. Clara May's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her father's calm confidence settled over her like a familiar old coat. She had crossed the line. There was no going back. She met his gaze directly, respectfully. "Your watch, sir," she repeated, her voice steady. "The pallet jewel on the escapement lever is dislodged. It's jamming the escape wheel. From this angle, it doesn't appear to be fractured. It just needs to be nudged back into its setting." Julian exchanged a stunned look with Evelyn. "You're a waitress," he stated, the words hanging in the air, heavy with implication. "What in God's name would you know about the escapement of a Vacheron Constantin tourbillon?" "Yes, sir, I am," Clara May replied, her chin held high. "But before I came to New York, I was my father's apprentice, Earl Thompson. He was a mechanic and a horologist back in Boone County, West Virginia. He could fix anything that ticked or turned. He taught me everything he knew. I've spent more hours of my life looking at watch movements than I have at just about anything else." The table was utterly still. Even the low murmur of the restaurant around them seemed to have faded into the background. "You're telling me," Julian said, his voice laced with incredulity, "that you can diagnose a problem in a custom-built, one-of-a-kind movement just by looking at it from 3 feet away?" "I can," she said simply. "My father taught me to see systems. That movement, it's a beautiful system, but one piece is out of place. If you'll allow me to hold it, I can tell you if it's something I can correct. There's a chance, a small one, that it can be coaxed back into position without a full disassembly." Evelyn finally found her voice. "Julian, I don't think this is wise. The liability alone—" "How long?" Julian interrupted, his eyes locked on Clara May's. A desperate, irrational spark of hope was warring with a lifetime of cynical experience. Clara May considered it, her mind racing through the physics of the problem. If it works, the actual procedure would take less than a minute, maybe 30 seconds. "But sir," she added, forcing herself to be honest, "I have to warn you, the risk is enormous. I would be using an improvised tool. If I apply too much pressure, or from the wrong angle, I could shatter the jewel, scratch the lever, or damage the teeth on the escape wheel. The proper, safe solution is to send it to a master watchmaker in Switzerland." "They have a 9-month backlog," Julian said, his voice flat. He had called 2 weeks ago about a routine cleaning. He looked down at the dead watch, then back up at the young woman with the impossibly steady gaze. He saw the grease under one of her fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. He saw the faint exhaustion in her eyes. and he saw a flicker of her father in her expression, the quiet competence of someone who understood how things worked. "This watch," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "was built by my father. He poured the last years of his life into it. It's the only piece of him I have left." A wave of understanding passed between them, an invisible bridge spanning the vast chasm of their circumstances. Clara May thought of her father's worn leather toolkit, the only thing she'd taken from his garage, now sitting in her cramped corner of the Queen's apartment. "I understand, sir," she said softly. "I lost my father, too. All I have left of him is what he taught me. If you trust me with this, I will treat it as if it were his own." A long, agonizing moment stretched. Julian Vance, a man who made decisions based on terabytes of data and teams of analysts, was now faced with a choice based on nothing but instinct and the look in a stranger's eyes. Slowly, deliberately, he picked up the $5 million watch and held it out to her. "All right," he breathed. "Do it." Clara May's hands were surprisingly steady as she accepted the watch. She cradled it in her left palm as if it were a living thing. The platinum was cool and heavy, but what she truly felt was the crushing weight of the trust he had just placed in her. "I need a little more light," she said, moving toward the edge of the table, where a small, elegant lamp cast a pool of gold. "And I need a tool." Her eyes scanned the table. Silverware was too thick, the stem of a wine glass too fragile. Then her fingers went to her hair, which was pulled back in a tight regulation bun. She deftly plucked a single black metal bobby pin and straightened it. It was thin, strong, and had a coated tip that would minimize the risk of scratching the metal components. It wasn't a beryllium tweezer, but it would have to do. "Tools don't make the craftsman, Clara girl," her father's voice echoed in her memory. "The hands do." The entire table leaned in. Mr. Tanaka and his associates watched, mesmerized. Evelyn held her breath. Julian gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. Clara May angled the watch under the lamplight, peering through the caseback. She could see the problem with perfect clarity now. The tiny ruby jewel was wedged tight. She would have to apply pressure downward and laterally at the exact same time. It was a move that required a surgeon's precision. Too much force, and the jewel would crack. Too little, and it wouldn't move. The world dissolved. There was no 80-floor view, no billion-dollar deal, no snobbish manager who could fire her in a heartbeat. There was only the watch, the bobby pin, and the ghost of her father standing at her shoulder. She took a slow, steadying breath, the way Earl had taught her before making a delicate weld. She inserted the tip of the bobby pin through a tiny gap in the movement's architecture, navigating past the furiously coiled hairspring and the motionless balance wheel. Her approach had to be perfect. She touched the edge of the displaced jewel. She applied a feather-light pressure. Nothing. It was wedged tighter than she thought. A bead of sweat trickled down her temple. She adjusted the angle of the bobby pin by a fraction of a degree and tried again, this time applying a steady, building pressure. She could feel the pin begin to flex. Her own pulse was a roar in her ears. "Is it moving?" Julian whispered, his voice strained. Clara May didn't answer. She was in the zone, a place of pure mechanical focus her father had called the quiet. She pushed a fraction harder, her entire being concentrated on that single point of contact where a cheap bobby pin met a priceless jewel. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then she felt it. A microscopic give. Not a click, not a snap, but a subtle yielding, a release of tension so minute that anyone else would have missed it. It was the moment of truth. With a final controlled impulse, she nudged the jewel. It slid into place with a movement so small it was almost imperceptible. But the result was an instantaneous miracle. Freed from its prison, the escape wheel jumped, engaging the lever. The balance wheel, released from its stasis, began to oscillate, its rhythmic dance breathing life back into the machine. The motion cascaded through the gear train like a current. The tourbillon cage began its majestic 1-minute rotation. And on the other side, the platinum second hand sprang forward, resuming its elegant sweep around the lapis lazuli dial. Tick, tick, tick. The sound, so faint, was as loud as a cannon blast in the silent room. Clara May didn't move. She watched for a full minute, her breath held as the tourbillon completed a full rotation, as the second hand swept a perfect circle. Everything was in harmony. The system was whole again. Her father's lessons had held true. "My God!" Evelyn breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. "It's working." Julian said nothing. He simply stared, his face a canvas of raw, unguarded emotion. Tears welled in his eyes and traced paths down his cheeks. He didn't bother to wipe them away. The relief that washed over him was so profound, so overwhelming. It was almost painful. Gently, reverently, Clara May withdrew the bobby pin. She inspected the movement one last time, then turned and presented the watch to Julian with both hands, as if she were returning a piece of his own soul. "Your father's watch, sir," she said, her voice soft but sure. "It's keeping time again." Julian reached out with a trembling hand and took it. He lifted it to his ear, listening to the steady, strong heartbeat he thought he had lost forever. He closed his eyes, and for a second, he was a boy again in his father's workshop, surrounded by the smell of oil and the beautiful, orderly chaos of creation. He looked at Clara May, truly seeing the young woman who had just performed an impossible feat. "How?" he started, his voice thick with emotion. "How did you do that?" Clara May offered a small, sad smile. "My father always said every machine has a memory. To fix it, you just have to listen to its story. I just listened." But their moment was shattered by a harsh, indignant voice. "What in the name of God is going on here?" Marcus Thorne stood there, his face purple with rage. He had been observing from across the room, his fury mounting with every second this low-level waitress spent interacting with his most important guest. "Thompson! Get away from that table immediately! You are fired!" Marcus Thorne advanced on the table like a storm front, his face a mask of theatrical fury. To him, the scene was an unforgivable breach of every protocol he held sacred. A waitress, a girl from the backwoods no less, was not only speaking to Julian Vance, but had dared to touch his personal property. "I said you are fired," Thorne repeated, his voice rising, sharp enough to draw the attention of nearby tables. He grabbed Clara May's arm, his fingers digging into her bicep. "Your little performance is over. Get your things and get out of my restaurant. You will be lucky if Mr. Vance doesn't have you arrested for damaging his property." Clara May flinched, both from the pain in her arm and the public humiliation. The fragile bubble of connection and triumph burst, leaving her exposed and terrified. She had known she was breaking the rules, but she hadn't anticipated this level of vitriol. "Let go of her," Julian Vance said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, yet it cut through Thorne's tirade with the chilling efficiency of a razor. It was the voice he used in boardrooms just before dismantling a rival company. Thorne froze, his hand still clamped on Clara May's arm. He turned to Vance, his expression shifting from rage to a fawning, confused obsequiousness. "Mr. Vance, my deepest apologies. I assure you, this employee will be dealt with in the severest possible terms. Her presumption is simply staggering." "I said," Julian repeated, slowly rising from his chair to his full, imposing height. "Let go of her. Now." Thorne released Clara May's arm, as if it were red hot. She stumbled back a step, rubbing the sore spot, her face burning with shame. Julian took a deliberate step forward, placing himself between Thorne and Clara May. He looked the manager up and down, his gaze filled with a kind of analytical contempt that was far more withering than simple anger. "Your name is Marcus Thorne, isn't it? General Manager." It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir, Mr. Vance," Thorne stammered, straightening his tie. "I am responsible for ensuring our guests have a flawless experience, and this is unacceptable." "You're right," Julian said, his voice dropping even lower. "It is unacceptable. I have just witnessed an act of breathtaking skill and empathy, performed under immense pressure. And your response is to physically assault her and scream in the middle of your dining room. You talk about a flawless experience? You, sir, are the single biggest flaw in this establishment." Thorne's jaw worked silently, his face draining of color. The other diners were now openly staring, their hushed conversations rep. The manager's words were a physical blow, and for a terrifying second, the crystalline air of the apex fractured into the jagged, familiar landscape of her life. The foreman yelling at her father, the bank officer's cold dismissal, the endless chorus of voices reminding her of her place. Thorne's fingers, digging into her arm, were the anchor pulling her back down into the depths, away from the impossible, shimmering surface she had just breached. Humiliation, hot and acidic, rose in her throat. "Let go of her!" The voice was not loud. It was a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the very floor, silencing the clink of silverware and the murmur of distant conversation. It was the sound of absolute authority, of a tectonic plate shifting deep beneath the earth. Marcus Thorne froze, his face a comical mask of rage melting into panic. He turned to Julian Vance, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. "Mr. Vance, I am so sorry," he sputtered, his grip loosening but not releasing. "This is a gross violation of our service standards. I will personally escort her from the premises." Julian rose from his chair. He didn't move quickly. He didn't have to. The simple act of him standing was an event, a shift in the room's center of gravity. He was taller than Thorne, and in that moment he seemed to loom, a monolith of bespoke wool and controlled fury. He looked not at Thorne's face, but at his hand, still clamped on Clara May's arm. "I will not repeat myself a third time," Julian said, and the quietness of the statement was more threatening than any shout. Thorne snatched his hand back, as if he'd touched a live wire. Clara May stumbled, a small gasp escaping her lips, and found a steadying hand on her elbow. It was Evelyn Reed, Julian's counsel, her expression one of cool, professional anger, directed squarely at the manager. Julian took one deliberate step forward, his gaze finally lifting to meet Thorne's. "You speak of service standards. Let's analyze your performance, shall we, Mr. Thorne? Your primary function is to manage this environment, to ensure its optimal operation for the benefit of your clientele. A system like any other." He paused, letting the word hang in the air. Tonight, a critical component within this system, a guest, a human being, experienced a catastrophic emotional and mechanical failure. Your protocol did not account for this. Your training was insufficient. You, the system manager, were useless. Thorne's face had gone from purple to a waxy, bloodless white. "Into this failure," Julian continued, his voice a clinical dissection, "stepped Miss Thompson, an employee you, presumably, hired but clearly failed to understand. She correctly diagnosed a complex, multifaceted problem from a distance. She proposed a high-risk, high-reward solution under extreme psychological pressure. She then executed that solution with a level of precision and skill that the finest artisans in Geneva would applaud. She did not violate your standards, she transcended them. She restored functionality where you could only offer platitudes, and your response, as manager, was to introduce chaos, to physically accost her, and to attempt to expel the most valuable human asset in this room. He fell silent. The silence was an indictment, a verdict. Every diner within earshot was rapt, witnessing a corporate execution performed with the elegance of a symphony. Julian turned his back on the manager, a gesture of such complete dismissal it was more brutal than a punch. He faced Clara May, and the cold fire in his eyes was replaced by something complex and raw. Concern, awe, gratitude. "Miss Thompson," he began, his voice softening. "Clara May," she whispered, the name feeling foreign on her own tongue after years of being Thompson or, "Excuse me, miss." "Clara May," he repeated, testing the sound of it. He reached into his jacket and produced a card case of brushed platinum. "I find myself in a position I am unaccustomed to. I am in your debt, a debt of a magnitude that is difficult to quantify." He looked at the watch on his wrist, its steady, ticking a new and vibrant pulse. "You did not merely fix an object. You restored a conversation I thought had ended a decade ago." He held out a business card. "My chief of staff is Anya Sharma. Her number is on there. She will contact you at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Please be available to take her call." This was it. The brush off. A handsome tip, a polite thank you, and then back to their separate universes. She reached for the card with a hand that trembled slightly. "This is not," he said, anticipating her thought, "a transaction that can be concluded with a tip. This is the beginning of a professional engagement." He glanced at his own table, where Kenji Tanaka was watching the proceedings with an unreadable, serene expression. "Mr. Tanaka, my apologies for this interruption. Evelyn will conclude our evening. Please enjoy your dessert on me. I find I have a more pressing matter to attend to." He gestured to a small, secluded lounge area near the windows, furnished with 2 velvet armchairs. "Clara May, would you grant me 5 more minutes of your time?" It wasn't a request. It was a gentle command, wrapped in the language of courtesy. She nodded, mute, and allowed him to guide her toward the chairs. As she walked away, she heard Mr. Tanaka speak for the first time in a long while, his English precise and accented. "A remarkable demonstration of shokunin, Vanse-san," he said, using the Japanese term for an artisan who dedicates their life to their craft. "You are wise to recognize it." Seated by the vast window, the city lights a glittering tapestry below, Clara May felt like an astronaut untethered from her ship. Julian did not sit immediately. He stood for a moment, looking down at the watch, then out at the view. "My father, David," he began, his voice quieter now, intensely personal. "He was an engineer, a genius, I believe. He designed revolutionary engine components, hydraulic systems, but he never had the temperament for business. He saw beauty in efficiency, in the perfect interaction of moving parts. He died with a portfolio of brilliant patents and a modest bank account. He built things that worked, but he never built an empire." He finally sat down opposite her. "I did the opposite. I took one of his core ideas about energy storage and I built this." He gestured vaguely at the city. "An empire. But I never designed the core mechanism myself. I managed the system. I didn't create the components. He gave me this watch a week before he passed. He said, 'I never gave you a dynasty, Julian. I only knew how to build things. This is the best thing I ever built. Don't waste your time. Build something that matters.'" He looked at her, and his eyes, which the world saw as shrewd and calculating, were filled with a profound, weary sorrow. For 10 years I thought he meant the company, the money, the influence. I thought that was what mattered. But tonight, when it stopped, when the heart of his work went silent, I realized I had misunderstood him completely. The empire is just a complex machine. He wanted me to understand the gears. Clara May found her voice, a small, fragile thing. My father, Earl, he used to say the same thing. Not in those words. He'd say, "Everything's a system, Clara girl. Understand the system, you can fix anything." He'd fix a neighbor's tractor for a bushel of corn. He'd spend a week coaxing a Civil War-era clock back to life for $20 because he couldn't stand to see a beautiful machine fall silent. She swallowed, the memory a painful lump in her throat. He died with a mountain of medical bills and a garage full of other people's fixed engines. A profound, silent understanding passed between them. They were two sides of the same coin, the children of unheralded geniuses, each navigating their father's legacy in a world that measured worth in dollars, not skill. "Anya will call you tomorrow," Julian said, his tone shifting back to one of quiet command. "First, we will address the immediate logistical problem. Your father's debts. They will be settled, in full. Second, your family's stability. A trust will be established for your grandmother that will provide for her comprehensive care for the remainder of her life. This is non-negotiable, and it is not a gift. It is my company retaining the services of a uniquely qualified consultant. Your fee for services rendered tonight." Her mind reeled. The numbers were astronomical, impossible. "Sir, Mr. Vance, I can't." "You can and you will," he said firmly but not unkindly. "Accepting payment for your expertise is the first step in valuing it correctly. Which brings me to the third and most important point." He leaned forward, his intensity magnetic. "Your father gave you a gift, Clara May, a legacy of knowledge. You have honored it by using it to survive. Now it is time to honor it by allowing it to flourish. To let that knowledge languish serving coffee in a place like this, it would be an unforgivable waste. A system operating at less than 1% of its potential efficiency." "I always dreamed of going to watchmaking school," she confessed, the words tasting like a childhood fantasy. "But it was never—" "It is now," he interrupted. "There is a school in Pennsylvania, the Littitz Watch Technicum, and others in Switzerland. You will have your choice. My educational foundation will provide a full, unconditional scholarship. Tuition, housing, tools, living expenses, everything you need to focus solely on your craft for the next 2 years. Your only obligation will be to yourself, to become the master horologist your father trained you to be." Tears, hot and unstoppable, began to stream down her face. They weren't tears of sadness or fear, but of a pressure valve releasing after a lifetime of being wound too tight. It was the shock of an impossible dream, not just appearing, but being presented as a logical, structured plan. "Why?" she finally managed to ask, the single word encompassing a universe of disbelief. "Why would you do all this for me?" Julian looked at the watch on his wrist, the second hand sweeping with perfect, restored grace. "Because you didn't just fix a machine, Clara May. You reminded me what it means to understand one. You reminded me of my father. And because talent like yours is the rarest, most valuable resource on the planet, investing in it is the most logical, high-yield decision I could possibly make." He stood up, signaling the end of their meeting. "Go home, Clara May Thompson. Get some rest. Your life is about to become considerably more complex. Anya will handle everything." He turned and walked away, leaving her alone by the window, the glittering, indifferent city sprawling at her feet, no longer a symbol of her insignificance, but a landscape of impossible, terrifying promise. The 2 weeks that followed were an exercise in controlled demolition and reconstruction. Anya Sharma was less a person and more a force of nature, a calm, disembodied voice on the phone who vaporized obstacles with terrifying efficiency. The call came at 9:00 a.m. sharp. There was no preamble. "Clara May, this is Anya Sharma. I am Julian Vance's Chief of Staff. I have a 3-point agenda for this call. First, debt reconciliation. Second, the Thompson Family Trust. Third, your academic placement." "Do you have a pen?" Clara May, sitting on the lumpy couch that smelled of stale pizza, scribbled notes on the back of a utility bill as Anya laid out the blueprint for her new life. The numbers were so vast they were meaningless. The medical debt, an Everest that had shadowed her every waking moment, was spoken of as a liability to be cleared. A financial advisor, a patient man named Mr. Chen, called an hour later to discuss the trust for her grandmother. He spoke of investments and yields, but all Clara May heard was the translation. "Your grandmother will be safe. She will be warm. She will never have to worry again." The phone call to her grandmother was the hardest and most beautiful thing she had ever done. She tried 3 times to explain, her voice cracking, before the old woman, her Appalachian pragmatism warring with a lifetime of hardship, finally accepted. It wasn't a cruel joke. The sound of her grandmother's weeping was a release of generational burdens, a sound of such pure, unadulterated relief that it brought Clara May to her knees in the cramped hallway of her Queens apartment. Leaving the apex was surreal. Marcus Thorne was gone, vanished into the corporate ether. The new interim manager, a woman promoted from head of service, treated Clara May with a sort of baffled reverence. Her colleagues, who had once pitied her quiet diligence, now looked at her with a mixture of awe and a desperate, hungry hope, as if she were proof that the lottery of life was not entirely rigged. They threw her a small party, pooling their tips to buy her a cake and a simple, elegant set of watchmaker's tweezers in a velvet case. It was the most thoughtful gift she had ever received. Her last night in Queens was sleepless. She lay on the couch, listening to the city's ceaseless symphony, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of the subway, the shouts from the street below. For years, this sound had been the soundtrack to her exhaustion, the rhythm of her struggle. Now, it sounded different. Not like a cage, but like a starting gun. She was leaving this world of ghosts and grime, but she knew she would carry its lessons with her forever. The grit, the resilience, the quiet observation of a system from its lowest rungs. Lititz, Pennsylvania, was a shock to her system. It was a town steeped in a quiet, historical reverence, the air clean and smelling of grass instead of exhaust fumes. The Watch Technicum was a temple of silence and light. Sunlight streamed through massive windows onto rows of benches, each a self-contained world of gleaming brass, polished steel, and focused intent. Here, no one cared about her accent or her second-hand clothes. The only currency was the steadiness of your hand and the sharpness of your eye. The work was brutally demanding, more so than she could have ever imagined. It was one thing to have an intuitive knack. It was another to master the underlying physics, metallurgy, and mathematics. Her days were a blur of lectures on isochronism and the Breguet overcoil, followed by 10-hour stretches at the bench, her world shrinking to the microscopic landscape viewed through her loop. She learned to make her own tools, milling a screwdriver to perfect dimensions, polishing a pivot until it shone like a black diamond. There were moments of crushing doubt. A month into the program, while disassembling a notoriously complex Jaeger-LeCoultre movement, Her hand slipped. The escape wheel, no bigger than a sequin, flew from her tweezers, skittered across the bench, and vanished onto the floor. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She spent 2 hours on her hands and knees with a flashlight, her mind screaming that she was a fraud, an imposter from the coal hollows who had no place in this pristine world of Swiss precision. Julian Vance had made a terrible mistake. She found the wheel, finally, nestled against the leg of her stool. Her hands shaking, she returned to her bench. She didn't pick up the wheel. Instead, she closed her eyes and forced herself to breathe. She pictured her father's garage, the smell of oil, the patient scratch of a file on metal. "Take a break, Clara girl." His voice echoed in her mind. Systems overloaded. Let it cool down. She went for a walk, and when she returned, her hands were steady. The work was not about perfection. It was about recovery. It was about understanding the system well enough to fix it when it broke. That night, she reassembled the movement flawlessly. She had not just learned a lesson in mechanics, she had learned one about herself. She excelled. Her father's practical, often improvised lessons gave her a unique perspective. While her classmates saw a series of discrete steps in a manual, she saw a holistic system, a conversation between parts. She developed a reputation for being able to diagnose problems others missed, for having a feel for the machines. A year into her 2-year program, a crate arrived for her, delivered by a specialized art courier. It was heavy, made of dark, polished wood, with a simple, engraved brass plate that read, "From the office of Julian Vance." Inside, nestled in custom-cut, archival foam, were not watches, but 10 thick, leather-bound journals. They were accompanied by a single, heavy sheet of cream-colored stationery. The note was handwritten in a sharp, decisive script. Clara May. I mentioned my father was a genius. This is the proof. These are his private design journals from the last 20 years of his life. They contain his theoretical work, designs for complications that have never been built, new escapement theories, thoughts on the use of non-traditional materials. He was working in a vacuum, without funding or recognition. I have had them in a vault for a decade. I have shown them to the finest minds at Vacheron Constantin and Patek Philippe. They called them brilliant but impractical, the work of a theorist untethered from the realities of production. I believe they are wrong. They are simply reading the text without understanding the language. You, I suspect, speak the same language. You are the daughter of Earl Thompson, who could make magic in a dusty garage. You understand that practicality is often just a failure of imagination. This is not an assignment. This is a key. What door it opens, I do not know. But I believe you are the one meant to turn it. Keep building things that matter. J4. That night, in the quiet solitude of her small apartment, Clara May opened the first journal. The pages smelled of old paper, ink, and the faint, ghostly scent of her father's workshop. The handwriting was dense, the diagrams intricate, filled with a feverish creative energy. It was overwhelming, the work of a mind, operating on a level she could barely comprehend. She spent weeks reading them, staying up late into the night, the world of her studies fading into the background as she fell headfirst into the world of David Vance. The experts were right, in a way. His ideas were radical, a gravity-immune tourbillon that used magnetic suspension, a perpetual calendar powered by infinitesimal changes in barometric pressure, a minute repeater that used a resonating crystal structure instead of gongs. They were brilliant and utterly impossible to manufacture with traditional techniques. Then, in the 7th journal, she found it. A series of sketches, annotated with frantic, sprawling notes. It was a design for a new kind of escapement. He called it the resonant lock. It was designed to be perfectly isochronous, unaffected by the slow decline of power from the mainspring. But it required a component of impossible complexity, a pallet lever made of a single, grown crystal, shaped with a precision beyond any milling machine. It was a dead end. A beautiful, tragic dead end. But as Clara May stared at the drawing, a ghost of a memory stirred, a conversation with her father years ago. He had been trying to fix the timing on an old cheap pickup truck. "The problem ain't the engine, Clara girl," he'd said, wiping grease from his hands. "It's the vibration. Everything's got a frequency, a note it wants to sing. If you can make the parts sing the same note, they'll work together forever. Harmonious resonance. That's the secret. Harmonious resonance." She looked back at David Vance's diagram. He had been trying to solve the problem mechanically, forcing the system into submission with an impossible component. But her father, Earl Thompson, would have approached it differently. He wouldn't have tried to force it. He would have tried to tune it. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. She grabbed a piece of tracing paper and laid it over the diagram. She wasn't an heir to one legacy. She was the bridge between two. David Vance, the brilliant theorist. Earl Thompson, the pragmatic genius of the garage. One had written the music, the other had known how to tune the instrument. With a hand that was now supremely steady, she began to sketch. She kept Vance's core design, but she modified the geometry, changing the angles, altering the mass of the balance wheel, redesigning the hairspring's terminal curve. She wasn't just copying his work, she was in conversation with it, using her father's intuitive, practical knowledge to solve the theorist's impossible equation. She was building a system, finding the one little piece that was out of place and tuning it until it sang in harmony with the rest. The sun was rising, casting a pale, golden light across her workbench when she finally put her pencil down. On the paper before her was something new, a synthesis, a design that was not just beautiful, not just theoretical, but possible. She was no longer just Earl Thompson's daughter. She was no longer just Julian Vance's protégée. She was a watchmaker, and her work had just begun. The greater, ticking system of her own life was finally, perfectly, in beat.